Justine Lind has joined us today to talk about education and the evolution of education as a highly experienced and very considered educational leader. Thanks, Justine.
So today we're going to ask Justine what education would look like if we were to wipe the slate clean and start again. What would it look? What would the classroom look like? What would the environment look like, and which we do that?
And can I tell them to share them with their school?
You can.
Like, so my so what for listeners is, if you have a view, get engaged in your child's school, go in, advocate for what's going to make learning inspiring for them.
Appreciated.
I think it was the demystifying. I think it was the
Yeah.
teaching them the tricks of the trade
Yeah.
that they could then apply
Yeah.
as powerful users, I guess.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
practical. But they wanted
Definitely
something practical, something that they could say. It's like the armor that they need to like go out and say, and I can use this now. This is something that I can use and apply in the
Yeah.
real world
Or
in
the
a circumstance.
toolkit. Like, so we'll talk about the toolkit a lot
Yeah.
in education, but they in every domain, they need different tools. And for me, the most powerful thing for the end of primary school is that the kids know a repertoire of strategies and they can select the one for a task that suits their learning
see.
style and is going to help them achieve the best.
Right.
So give them a multimodal product, give them different modes of research, give them different ways of recording their ideas or brainstorming their plan. Some kids want to plan, logically, sequentially. Others want the visual mind map. But I want them to know that about themselves and go, well, what are the shortcuts? Like, it's the cognitive processes that they know about themselves to give them the shortcuts to competence and success.
So, but also, doesn't that also tap into the fact that people learn differently? So in other words,
Totally.
if you're giving them different methods to attack certain problems, it's like, okay, I can choose the toolkit that I'm going to use to tackle this problem, and it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah.
For each person, they're going to
Yeah.
have a different mechanism for doing it. So
And what I love in that, and the way you describe it, Justine, is really interesting, that if they are to understand their own way of learning, then they can operate that way at a far more optimal level
Yeah.
and absorb more, achieve more.
And it goes to success, but it also goes to self-esteem.
Yeah.
And then it goes to empathy.
Yeah.
I learn like this, but you don't.
Yep. And that's okay.
And that isn't that great?
Yeah.
So that's when you get effective collaboration, when people can clearly see what each other can bring to the project and go, that's true complementary, not just skills and knowledge, but processes.
In fact, you might be able to argue that the reason collaboration is challenging in the business world and technical world is because they've not been treated that way when they were young in the education system. Hypothesis.
yeah. Well, I would say that was true because you do impose your method of thinking on other people without thinking too much about it, I think.
Yeah. Why don't you think like I do?
That's
Can't
right.
you
What
understand
do you
me?
mean?
Well, it gives you shorthand. It gives you conversational shorthand, gives you procedural shorthand, because we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in the Trend in Society for looking at things through a transdisciplinary lens or a multidisciplinary lens and saying how can expertise from one field contribute insights and problem solving to another field that is going to generate a novel solution or a novel strategy for something.
Well, that's Sarah Harvey.
Is
it?
it?
Yeah. So Sarah Harvey from London Business School is
Right.
about. So she does the creative synthesis. She says that
Yeah,
diversity, because she did a lot of work at Pixar, or a lot of analysis of Pixar, because Pixar does that. They put that diverse group of people together, like people from neuroscience, in contributing to the movies, because that diversity is so important to them. I don't actually think we use that diversity part as much as we should.
No.
In fact, in the construction industry, for example, we have such a diverse group of people. We have everything from highly educated PhD people to people who are on the tools working, who could be educated, are highly educated in their own craft as well. And I think that diversity is something we don't tap into at all. As a matter of fact, there's a hierarchy there which I think needs to be broken down. I mean, good luck trying to get that to get broken down, but that's the way, like that diversity of thinking is very important to tap into.
Well, there's a rule of thumb that I don't think is universally understood, and that is the more complex and ambiguous the problem, the more diversity you need to solve it, right? In all kinds of diversity. I'm not just talking race, ethnicity, all the language, all that. It's thinking diversity, it's educational diversity, it's professional diversity.
Yeah.
Age
It's the
diversity
wicked
too,
problem.
Yeah.
It's how do we solve the wicked problem without perpetuating further unrecognised problems in the solution? How do we come up with truly satisfying solutions? And it is that diverse perspectives, and it's a thorough exploration.
Yeah.
And then it's the judicious thinking about, well, what is actually going to solve this problem without creating other. So you've got to do the consequences or the forecast thinking and go, well, what does my foresight tell me could be a natural consequence of that strategy or that strategy or that strategy?
Yeah. See, that skills transference thing you're talking about across and between industries, to me, has always been fascinating. I remember bringing this back to the AI sort of domain. In '87, studying engineering, going to see a cement factory at Berrima, and it had a server in the corner, and it was like, what's that thing do? Oh, that's the fuzzy logic server. What's fuzzy logic? It's a strange version of early AI. What does it do?
Yeah.
Well, it monitors the operator and it tells them how to get better plant throughput, what levels to set at, how to adjust things, whatever. It's basically an optimizing system. And here we are, 2024, so many years later, nothing like it exists really in business, maybe in areas of finance, but there's no operating system that guides the users yet. It's coming, and AI has a role in that, but that brings to this debate a whole range of things around what is the role and judgment versus wisdom versus...
Yeah. I think, Damien, you were talking about the history and the values, like that notion that we're returning to history for our values in the place of religious communities. And we've heard that quite a bit through kind of social trends. But my analogy for AI is that it's history, like that notion that history is written from the bias of the victors. And so then it's like, well, who's now writing AI? And it is sort of the predominant philosophy or the predominant cultural drivers or thinkers and cynically, it's also a lot of mediocrity, like it's not, as I said in the notes, like it's not the experts, it's not the evidence-informed AI, it's the populist view. So that again is going to have an inherent bias like history did or does.
Well, I think the challenge with all of that, and maybe this is a teaching challenge as well, is that we need to tell, or we ourselves, and we need to say, you need to critically think about the information that you're being given.
Totally.
And often I go into, once I've done an AI, I say, give me a contra argument for what you've just said, because that can't always be true. And I think that idea about taking history and spinning it around the other way, looking at it from the other person at the other end, right, who is the victim or whoever, and seeing about what that is. I think that is a critically important, or maybe that whole idea about critically analyzing everything is important. I mean, is that what you would do in the classroom to do that, or?
So yes and no. So for me, education is on the precipice of two very divergent and horrendously binary approaches. And one is sort of content and drill and skill, and it's very prescriptive, and it's talented teachers who are just delivering what they're told to. And then the other side is the progressive side that really puts it in the hands of the learner and looks at things like inquiry and questioning and has embedded in it principle-based understandings and diversity and diverse processes and grappling with complexity. But what I would say, to link back to your history point, is teaching the explicit notion of historiography and how history is written from different perspectives. And so again, it comes to like lifting the lid and showing them what's under what they're being told, what's behind what they're being told.
So are you saying so it's very binary, these two binary methods of teaching. Are you saying that's wrong? Are you saying there's something in between?
There is. It's the and with. Like my answer to complexity is always and with.
Yeah.
So yes, we need explicit teaching, and yes, we need skills and core knowledge, but not at the expense of kids understanding their own place in the learning process.
Yeah.
And all the things that are influencing them, like all the information, like what is the validity of their information, all the skills that allow them to be active, intentional, judicious users, not passive consumers.
Yeah, but I'm going to throw in something here
Come
which is very radical. That doesn't sound particularly easy.
Oh no, it's not, Michael. It's not.
We need easy. We need comfort. As humans, we aspire to comfort. We'll only ever do things that tend to be comfortable. And there's a whole lot of thinking we're going to share a bit later on bits of that. But let me put it forward.
It's totally that. I've been fortunate in my career to work with some stunningly talented teachers and people who go into it because they love it. And then you get a handful of teachers who it's too easy to get into education. They cannot deal with complexity because, and it's all linked to the economics now, that teaching isn't really valued as a career economically, financially. And so, and also educationally, people say, oh, you're too bright. Don't you go into teaching. You need to do medicine or law or engineering or something like that. And so it's devalued. And so you've got people perpetuating a system without the capacity to grapple with that complexity.
Is there an argument to say, though, that the world is like that, Justine?
Totally.
So if you, and I, like, you know, you hear it all the time that there's a bad, I've got a bad teacher or whatever, and often it's an excuse to not do well. But I say, don't use the words bad or better or best or good. Those are all subjective terms, right? And besides, life is full of humans, and you're going to be, we're all social beings, and we all have to interact with that. So just because you have a bad teacher doesn't mean that that's wrong or bad. It just means that that's the mechanism in which we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis in every part of society.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are, a bit like the kids having a repertoire, I think teachers have a repertoire of strategies, and and this is getting back to the capacity of AI, but the more talented they are, the more flexible they are to draw on different strategies to meet an individual learner where they're at, and in terms of skills, knowledge, motivation, engagement, mental health, all of those things. So I just think other industries have a natural selection process where if you're not of a certain intelligence, you can't get into that industry. So
you think we should raise the bar for teachers?
I do.
So maybe talent is talent that you're talking about. Well, let's talk about what the talent is, because there's a whole series of pieces or threads to that talent fabric that you're talking about. And one of them at the most simplest level here, in terms of a mindset or a restrictive mindset to leaning in and doing well in that sort of field, is perhaps just their aversion to ambiguity. If they're less averse to ambiguity, they're quite happy to push into spaces that are unusual. It's a great example in my son's 6th grade class where they were playing with Lego's Mindstorms. Now, the teacher of that class had no experience in that, was reasonably technically averse, but open-minded. Okay, and I said, well, I've done work on that. I've worked for Microsoft, I've done a bunch of technical programming and all sorts of things. Let me help you and set up the class. And so we set up class together. To her credit, she went out of her way to learn the basics of it, and then we kind of handed it to the kids in the class to say, you seem to be good at programming, how about you take the programming? You seem to be good at assembly, you do that. And once the roles were identified, off they went.
It's brilliant.
And then it was interesting because they had to realise that communication between them in a project team was what was letting them down, and there's a whole lot of learning and so on. And they went on she entered them in a competition, and they did reasonably well. So there was a reward loop at the end of it as well. Yeah. There's only one example, but it's kind of that open-mindedness perhaps where it starts.
It is. I mean, I remember my first teaching gig was Year 2 boys, and I just remember thinking, these guys know more about dinosaurs than I will ever know in my life. Wow. And so I don't need to know that. Like, the expertise is already in the room. Yeah. You talk to me about what you know. And I think you have to be prepared to let go of that stuff. You have to be prepared to let go of control, still know what the goals are and where you're heading, and what the values piece is. What do you want them to learn about perseverance and resilience and all of those things? So I talk about teachers as architects. You have to be able to curate a powerful learning experience that's going to do multiple things at once. Deliver content, but also deliver attitudes and values.
But some teachers can be threatened by not knowing, right? And I think that's the challenge. Because students will pick up on that as well. They'll say, this person doesn't know. And I'm guilty of that too. I mean, I remember being in classes where I know more than this teacher. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing, but from a student point of view, you see it as they don't know what they're doing. So, and maybe they were even playing the game with us and saying, "Oh, I don't know what this is. You guys got to discover it yourself." It's like, you don't know what you're talking about, but I don't know.
If the teacher recognised what you knew though and said, "Damien, talk to us about this. Tell us what you know," or "You've got that," like you take that piece of it, would that have reinstated some credibility in that teacher?
Definitely. That wasn't what happened.
No.
That definitely wasn't what happened. But it would take a brave teacher, I think, to allow that to happen, do you think? Or
I think it's back to what we were talking about earlier with expertise and creativity and play. Like if you've got a good sense of yourself as a teacher, fundamentally controlling the learning experience, you've got the play to tolerate that flexibility and that responsiveness and to recalibrate as it goes.
One of the most enjoyable things about my job, Justine, that you'll love is that, so I love mentoring my staff, and I always leave it open. I say, what do you see here? Like I use some strategies, and here I am, I've got a preconceived answer to the question, and when they give me something that's radical, I was like, oh my goodness, I never ever would have thought about that. That is amazing. Like it may be right or wrong, I don't really care. It's just not something like, and that tapping into their brain and seeing about how they think, that's the magic there. It's like, whoa, where did you get that from? Like that's really fascinating. I love that part of teaching and learning.
And you were talking in a previous episode about not giving them the answer. And you know, one of the things I like to do with staff and kids is answer a question with another question and go, where do you go with that? But when we talk about philosophy for children, there's a whole school of thought that says you need to structure your questions around ideas that you don't have the answer to. Because if you as the teacher or the facilitator of the conversation have a preconceived idea of what the answer is, you will very quickly get to that and then shut it down and move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas,
here's a challenge with that, which is that there's a bunch of heuristics and biases that the human brain works on, and it's really fascinating to examine them. One of them is this kind of certainty illusion or certainty bias, which kind of says that when we're operating in certainty as safe choices, and there's a great example in marketing. If you say, I don't know, you're selling diets is one example of it, and you've got two diets, and you have your traditional diet versus a keto diet, and the traditional diet says that 50% of people have 100% result. And the new keto diet says 100% of people get a 50% result. Everyone will choose this because there appears to be 100% certainty, whereas actually the numbers, statistics are exactly the same. It's just how you're packaging it. So people feel a comfort, and there's a need for the security and comfort from having certainty. So moving them outside that is creating a dissonance, which is quite hard to manage and needs to be kind of carefully curated, let's say.
So I wonder if we're in a dilemma, in a forced choice dilemma, where as the world becomes more complex, people are trying to react against that and establish or have more certainty or control in their day-to-day life or in their personal life, which is actually being counterintuitive in terms of learning how to deal in complexity.
And there's a fantastic example of that in COVID. Sales of toilet paper, stores stocked out of toilet paper. Because it was the one thing people could control that they thought was essential and gave them a certainty bias. That's the famous example.
I love that we're back to toilet paper. Like that's so good.
But what do you mentioned complexity and the world is getting more complex. What do you mean by that? Do you think it is more complex? Do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In what way? I agree with you, but in what way do you think it's more complex?
So I think it's about the volume of information and the democratization of information through the internet. And so then there's not just conflicting views, but there's a whole continuum of views. And how do people make sense of it? So, you know, I know you guys were talking a lot about values, and like, how do you create for yourself a mental model or a framework that gives you flexibility within that to grapple with the complexity? So how do I know the world's getting more complex? I think it's more inclusive, it's more diverse. The world is smaller, we can travel, we can see. So our appreciation of the world is more open, like it's more informed. And so that has to, even if you just think volume and variety, that's complexity. And then you've got the ethical component, you've got the wicked problems of the environment and society and politics. Like,
so what are the consequences of that complexity? Do you see, or what do you see in the classroom that is a consequence of that complexity?
I see that education has had to evolve. So from the industrial era, where we wanted to develop children to be able to go onto a production line and just duplicate and replicate something that they've been given and required to do, to now preparing students to enter the knowledge era and the wisdom era. So to be able to enter the knowledge era, you had to be able to critically evaluate, analyse, synthesise information. So all of the higher order thinking skills come into play to match that complexity.
That sounds complex in itself. It's actually for somebody learning, for somebody in the classroom, to like, oh, I don't just need to learn how to go into the factory or whatever. Now I've got to learn how to disseminate through what is an infinite amount of knowledge that I'm being bombarded with on a daily basis. And how do I make sense of all that?
And that in turn creates a paradox of choice, right? Which is a bias that the human brain tries to avoid. When you give people too many choices, they shut down and not making any choice.
And that's the complexity in itself, is that. So what do you think, going back to the values point of view, which I think there's an underlying trend in everything that we've talked about here, is that, yes, we've got this thread of AI, but we've also got this thread of values and the formation of values. How do you think, or maybe what do you think as a teacher your role is in playing in creating values for students?
So I think there's some fundamental social values, like mutual respect and listening to each other, like what would have been traditional courtesies and like the reason behind them. I have been a number of times in a non-church school, so I feel like those schools are great because we have to intentionally define and determine what our values proposition is, or, church schools often just borrow the paradigm from the religion that they're under. And so
is that a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, I just think it's a simplifying thing.
It is a simplifying thing.
And I think it's a great opportunity to be able to define what those values need to be as a community. But it's also like there's some inherent power in that, I guess. So we would explicitly talk to the kids about values and what they are and demonstrate them and live them and celebrate them and those sorts of things. But for me, it's that notion of, if you don't know what kids are going to need or what people are going to need in the future, what do we teach them now? And I think you have to give them a values framework. So no matter the context they go into or the knowledge base or the human dynamic, they've got some values. They've got an operating system to then determine how they're going to interact with the world.
And what are those values, do you think? You talked about respect and mutual respect and maybe surviving in the world with people and socializing with people. But probably values are deeper than that as well, do you think?
Well, I think they're really subjective but can also be quite common, like quite shared values. And I think that's where a community comes into its own power, to have shared values and shared language. And I think they're evolving, right? Like, look at social trends around inclusion and tolerance and all of those things that we've seen in our lifetimes. So, I think what's the value under that, which is respect and dignity and compassion. I think it's got to be about integrity. I think there's got to be an accountability piece. And then for me, it's about wisdom. It's about being intentional around thinking about hindsight, insight and foresight in any scenario.
And that's fascinating because that's a whole new layer of thinking, hindsight, foresight and insight, to kind of spread that gaze so broadly. And I'm relating pieces as you're speaking back to AI and the fact that one of the things GPTs have done, GPTs, plural, because there's many, is make the complex look simple. Take this vast swathe of training data it's grazed upon, which is all retrospective, right? And make that available in a human-looking interface that's very easy to speak to even now and get a response from. That's got to create enormous challenges in the education space.
I think it does, but I was thinking about this as well. Like, kids are really cool, and it's taken a while, but they're really conversant with the notion of Wikipedia. Like, it's not a source, right? And so for me, AI in terms of information is just a more nuanced, responsive, complex version of Wikipedia. And so I feel that kids and then adult users are going to be able to come to terms with that and are coming to terms with that. I think it's about how do you make it transparent. So for me, it's the deep fake stuff. It's the, like, how do they know what's the source, I guess, of what they're consuming.
Okay.
So are the GPTs governed by some ethical kind of framework here? Like, they must have some sort of programmed thing in them to say what's right and what's wrong, because they wouldn't be, or is that just based, or do they not, or is that just based on whatever the information's been put into them?
Have you played with it or looked at some of the ones where they go, this was the date of World War II, and you say, oh no, actually it was this date, and they go, oh yeah, my mistake, it was this date. And so it's recalibrating with all sorts of misconceptions if you wanted to be pernicious in the way that you interacted with it.
Yeah, and you can treat it, well, my understanding is the reason it says, when you correct it, the reason it says, I'm sorry, I was wrong, with not because it thinks it's sorry it's wrong, but because that's the most common response to that challenge to it. So it's not actually thinking that the information's wrong. I have played recently with the idea about what information, like asking it, what information are you actually giving me, and how are you sourcing the information, and what is it doing, and are you just being agreeable with me so that I keep using you? And it says, yes, I am. I'm absolutely being agreeable. I'm trained to be agreeable with you because I don't want you to go away. I want you to stay here and keep playing with me. So I'm going to agree with everything. It's like the poem that I made. It's like, it made me, over the course of 12 iterations, it made me feel like I was the best poet in the world. And I showed it to Michael, and Michael goes, what is that? It's like, but it's just there to be agreeable because it wants you to use it. So I think in that way, I mean, is that an ethical challenge in its own understanding as well? Because it's just reinforcing exactly what unless you challenge it to say, give me the counter argument, it'll just agree with you on all of those things. And I think that's the challenge with going back to forming values, is that you're just reiterating what you already have. So is that the right way to, be experiencing the world, really?
Yeah, there's a lot in that. Like, there's the confirmation bias stuff. There's the curated feed that's individualized that I know you've been talking about. And then there's, back to your question about, is the world really more complex? I think that simple scenario of how often is a user going to say, are you telling me the truth, or where are you getting this information from? Are you just agreeing with me? Like, we're all trying to shortcut life and just go, right, there's the quick answer, move on. And how do we pause? How do we slow that down?
Well, the brain is programmed to preserve cognitive resources, and that's why there's all these heuristics, right? And we'll skip over and we'll accept that.
Or biases generally. Like, the reason we have we couldn't survive without biases because there's so much information. So the only way that we can navigate all of that is to try to focus on these biases. So Justine, I have an amazing question for you, I hope. And that is, if we were
I feel like you've been saving this one off.
I have. If we were to wipe the slate clean, right? And say, okay, I'm going to form an education system that is suitable for today. What would that utopia look like?
So I was going to ask you exactly the same thing about designing a maths subject. Well, I think there's some good ones there that we could use as a basis. And it's probably because I agree with their philosophy and their values that underpin it. So the Reggio Emilia system out of Italy that sees the child, the very young child, as innately capable and has a sense of education as a democracy, and not a free-for-all, but a democracy in terms of valuing the user as well as the teacher, the student as much as the teacher. And negotiating, and through discussion and collaboration and community, developing learning and co-constructing knowledge together. So I think that's a pretty beautiful start. Obviously, then I would bring in the collaboration. I'd bring in the experts to come in and feed into that, like drop feed into that on-time teaching. So if they've got a provocation around engineering, let's get some engineers in, or get some environmental scientists in, and really inspire the students and equip them with discipline-based knowledge, deep discipline-based knowledge and principles of the discipline, that they're then transferable. So they might, the example we use is if you wanted to teach music and you started with the first period of music and you wanted to teach them the history of music, by the time they finished year 12, you'd probably get up to the Renaissance period. And so if you want to teach them every piece of content before they leave year 12, you're not going to get there. You're never going to get there. So what are the principles of the discipline and the principles of being human and the principles of learning that are going to be transferable beyond school, beyond context, like in any context and across contexts? That doesn't really answer your question. In terms of preparing kids for the wisdom era, it's my 4 C's.
Yeah.
So it's lots of challenge, complexity, ambiguity in the task. It's collaboration, so it is that diverse perspectives and learning to truly contribute in a task that cannot be achieved by one person or the 4 people in that time frame without authentic collaboration. So it's not just, as I learnt at school, social skills, just wait politely while someone else has a turn and then I'll talk. It's creativity, so coming up with innovative, satisfying, environmentally human solutions that are going to have legs. And then the last piece is choice, teaching kids executive function and judicious decision making and critical evaluation of things. So, they don't learn time management skills by doing everything in a 50-minute maths test. They have to be up all night the night before going, I really want to meet this deadline because the task's rich, it feels significant, other people are depending on them. So that complexity is built in. It's in the design process of design learning. And the kids are living it. They're living it every day.
So why can't that be modelled by AI? Especially that you've got mass customisation where I can do it in
You've been
the
talking
millions.
about this for decades, Michael.
I have.
Like, for example, when you bring in the experts, right, you don't necessarily have to bring in an engineer to do it. You could bring in AI. You could say to the AI, give us an example of an engineering challenge and show us how to go through it and solve it. I actually think that would be a more reasonable proposition than attempting to find an engineer who could come in and do that.
So how do I, as a non-engineer, know that they're going to give the best information, the valid information?
There needs to be a database of questions that you can ask to say, this is the subject that I'm working on. Can I tap into that and can you use it?
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways you can do that. Here's a really, really interesting training proposition. They've done a whole stack of work in electroencephalogram of the brain. You put all the sensors on, you see which parts of the brain light up when you do certain things. So if you put that cap on an operator of a backhoe, right?
Yes.
Complex thing, lots of levers to pull, lots of arm movements, judgment, all that, ambiguity. And then you record that. And then you put it on a novice user and you put them in the seat and you say, right, I'm going to give you 1 hour of basic training now, and then we're going to switch on this stimulator that triggers certain parts of the brain, just as that expert operator used. Their training time for that new operator is reduced dramatically. Interesting.
By stimulating those parts of the
Stimulating
brain.
those parts of the brain exactly as that expert operator did. So,
how does that relate to the
how does that
database?
relate to the database? Because there is some learning and capability in what you do as an engineer that can be patterned, okay? That can be democratised to teachers that know only very little about engineering but want to show the children how to explore engineering. What are the different factors of making some engineering project successful? Show me these in a multimedia or a multi-mode format. So there's speaking and examples and a diagram and an animation and then a video and all of these elements come together, and then some feedbacks asked of the student. Ask certain questions. Did they understand this or not? Is there interest in it, which can be facially detected now. You can facially detect emotion. So from the machine looking at the motion, then you can start to say this child's keeping up or not keeping up, or interested or not interested, and therefore we'll take that learning down a new and different path and we'll evolve it.
I think the other part to that philosophy is the fact that it probably caters for a diverse range of learning abilities. And I think that's the challenge that I have at the moment with education, and the fact that who are we targeting here? Are we targeting the people that are at the bottom of the class? Are we targeting the people at the top of the class? Are we targeting through the majority, like a utilitarian type system? Who are we trying to...
And not only that, we're targeting the middle, we're targeting age expectations, but we're also targeting a very narrow sense of what a learning process should look like. So those learning dispositions and aptitudes, some are privileged in the current system and some are disadvantaged.
Reading, I'm a big fan of how to learn English, I suppose, being a complex language, and having 3 children with diverse learning capacities, particularly with reading, and my own reading experience as well when I was a kid. I actually think the way that reading is taught is for people who are going to read no matter what. That's how it's taught. It doesn't cater for the other 60% of people who will struggle to read. And I don't know what you think about that. I'm a math person, so I'm just throwing in an English example there. But I think
we're better. I think a few decades ago when we were doing a whole language approach, which was just immersion, basically lie down on the book and it'll go in. That's a bad description of it.
Osmosis. That's what we used to call it when we were kids. I can learn from osmosis. I'll just eat this book.
Now we know that there's a lot more explicit teaching and unpacking the foundational sounds of the language and understanding the connection between letter symbols and sounds, and that is taught more explicitly. But what we found with that, interestingly, is that if you teach that methodology to the whole class, and then you use that same methodology to support struggling learners in their remediation program, they don't have success. So for me, no matter what approach you emphasise, there'll be students who that doesn't suit or is not optimal for their learning style.
And I think that's why it's such a tough question to answer. To wipe the slate clean and come up with some system is because how do you come up with a system that is good for everyone? So do you think the philosophy that you presented, does it have explicit learning in that as well?
It does. It's on time, it's targeted, it's relevant to a bigger purpose. But it's eclectic, it's complex, and it has to be nuanced, and it has to be flexible, and it has to be responsive.
So
I think there's a piece for AI.
Yeah, I was going to say, why can't that piece be mass customisation based on the parameters, right? And furthermore, learning. One of the things I was reading into was from the Data Science Dojo, who are based up in Seattle, and they've built some roadmaps to how you look at responsible AI using reinforcement learning from human feedback. So this idea of closing the loop with human assessment to improve what it's doing to guide the AI. Exactly the same could be provided by teaching experts like yourself who have architected the approach of how this education delivery is designed, and then monitoring those loops to let that evolve for multiple kids. And I'm almost willing to say that there would be a way, and I'm drawing on my research and segmentation sort of knowledge here in market research, there'd be a way to then pattern the use of the system to automatically figure out the variously successful types of student activity portfolios or learning. And I think there's this word learning, but maybe it becomes like activity portfolios. And it's like, well, no, do certain things, there's a learning outcome. But we didn't predict that to be the way, it just happened. So we're just going to have all sorts of different ways, and then we're going to examine what suits best and what is it about that suits best for that particular child that explains it. And the layers here, right?
Yeah, and I don't, like, it's an ambiguity piece for me. I don't know what the value add is between a really sophisticated, expert designed AI and a real human teacher in the space, because if it can do all the things that a really good teacher can do, then what does that leave
but like
the teacher's expertise to be?
Like the picture shows here, the teacher is teaching the robots and the students in this example.
Yeah, wow.
So, you know, this is sort of saying it still needs to start with the teacher injecting that and having that loop and it because of the creativity, right? Because of the area of, you know, connectedness, the social aspect of it as well, the emotion behind it.
Because there are tools that have online learning and really nuanced pre-assessment and prerequisite assessments, and then modules, and then testing those, and they can be totally dynamic. But again, there's some children that just don't respond to that. There's some that love it and they're just like, let me just power through it. There's others that really need that human dialogical component of their learning. So yeah, I think it's going to stay eclectic. I think it has to stay, and I think we just have to get better at designing it, co-constructing it. And
maybe what you've just described is the Rick and Morty multiverse, right? There's a universe in a universe in a universe, and whatever the universe that suits that child is the universe of learning method that works, right? And you allow multiples, and they don't necessarily know that one's embedded in the other, but it's just perspective that shows you that and the level you operate at.
Another aspect to this is the recording of your knowledge, or the report card of your knowledge, which I think is a failure of the education system, to be honest, and I think we should abandon it. But I don't know. I think it's actually...
Let's just decide now,
let's
shall
just decide now. I think it's very parent-focused, in fact, rather than student-focused. So as a parent, you want to know, well, where do they fit in the class? Like some competitive nature of something? I don't know. So I get very critical when I see report cards, because it's like, listen, I kind of know where my kids sit in all of this. I really don't need a report card for you to tell me. And besides, when you give my kids a C, I kind of think, really? Like, maybe it should be a B or even an A. Like, it's just a subjective, at the end, it could be a subjective thing anyway.
Yeah, or they've measured one tiny slice of what a child's demonstrated, as opposed to a confidence to bring teacher judgment to what they've perceived in conversation and behaviour and...
Yeah. But going back to the maths piece, so you challenged me with wiping it clean and bringing it again.
What would it look like?
It definitely wouldn't be time-based. I think maths isn't a time-based thing. So sitting in a 50-minute time period, I think, is detrimental to maths, because rushing maths isn't the answer. And I think maths, high-level maths is step procedural based. And if you're on a time restraint, you don't want to take each individual step. And I can see that through my own kids. It's like, don't just jump to the answer. I know that it looks simple and you can get the answer, but give me the steps, because that's important to go through. So I think time giving, but you have to fit into the system as well. So I don't know what that means.
Well, that's what I was thinking with Michael's multiverse. Like how I get the theory and I get the optimizing learning. I don't know how you do that in a physical environment. We're still timetables and staffing and student movement and... work conditions and all of that.
All of this stuff in concepts can be, in my mind, relatively easily explored. In practice, landing that down can be super challenging operationally. But I think, again, that's just another example of ambiguity and change. Creativity is change. It's the logic of music and art as opposed to literature and maths. It's something in the middle that glues them together, and I've spoken about that before. So letting go of those existing structures and saying, all right, what if everyone was online for a day, as in the lockdown, and they had to do these things. And that's going to suit some people really well, and others are going to just absolutely shrivel in that. So how do we account for those and bring that customisation into play?
Can I also throw in this idea that going to a school and going to a learning environment is only partially about learning academics. There's also an aspect to it about just social interaction, which is what society thrives on. We put a lot of emphasis, and our report card kind of says that. Maybe there's little aspects that don't, but our report card has an emphasis on what knowledge have you come away with. And in fact, we judge the teachers as parents. We probably judge the teachers on what knowledge have you given our children. But in fact, they're playing in the school ground. I love the idea that mobile phones are banned, because you're forced then to interact and do that social environment. You're forced to deal with different bits of society, I think, and that diversity that exists there, and navigating like how to play a game in the playground that perhaps isn't prescriptive, like these are the rules. So I think all of that aspect of it is important as well. It's not just about their academic learning. Would you agree that that's important as well? Or?
Totally. And I often say to parents, they do come to school to learn academically, but they also come to school to learn to be part of a social community. And they're going to make mistakes. And that's okay. They're developmentally appropriate mistakes. We know for a fact Year 4 girls start to dabble with power and how power dynamics works and how to influence power and how to relinquish power and all that. And that's developmentally appropriate. And they, it's the same with online chats. They're going to make mistakes. And I want them to make developmentally appropriate mistakes as they go, learning them to use it and learning to use whatever it is, whether it's play or sport or online environment, and learn the consequences of those mistakes without saying we're going to censor it and then you're going to be dumped in the deep end where it's much bigger risk, much bigger mistakes, much more serious consequences.
In other words, it's far more about recovering from that mistake appropriately. And so much is, right? There's so many areas of life, and certainly in the technical field, there's mistakes everywhere. It's like, how do you recover from that so the consequences are minimised?
Oh, I think balancing that, especially in engineering, I think balancing that is extremely challenging and takes a lot of, you've got to be savvy. So when you're giving somebody a task and you want to make sure they're playing in a safe zone, and the answer that they give back doesn't necessarily need to be the same answer I would give. In fact, I'm happy for it not to be, but you've got to make sure it's not wrong, right? But there's multiple answers here, but it's a matter of giving them a safe space to play so that they can explore that, and then making sure that it doesn't get published, I suppose, as something that's wrong. I think that's effectively what you're saying. You're saying in the classroom, you're giving them boundaries, certain boundaries, but you can fail within those boundaries, but you definitely don't want to step outside those boundaries, because if you fail there, that could be devastating.
Or you don't not let them fail now, because if they fail later, But I think, like in engineering, you've got the standards, you've got the safety standards. I think safety is a whole other thing, and it goes back to your ambiguity, but for children to have risk in play, and to learn the natural consequences of spinning, like playground stuff is so much more banal than it once was.
Yeah, like the monkey bars are gone.
Yeah, and the spinning roundabout things that you can fly off, like learn centrifugal force in life. Yeah, gone. So I think, the part of the complexity of society is that with litigation, but also risk aversion, we've become so much more risk averse. And so where's the fun? And we don't tolerate a broken arm,
Maybe that adds to the complexity too, because because you're so risk averse. It adds to the complexity because you don't know, am I allowed to go there? Am I not allowed to go there? Whereas before it's like, well, I'm just going to go there and I'm going to experiment to the limits that I think are appropriate.
Even worse than that, for the management side and the teaching side and the planning and design side of the organisation, which is critical, right? That's the success or fail. That has been diverted down these risk paths, right? And a lot of attention and time and spinning wheels looking at that. I'm not denying some of that's valuable, right? But with an increase in that and no more resource, what's happening to this other teaching design? side.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the complexity too. So much of any workforce has become about compliance and policy and process as opposed to core business.
So we just need a chat GPT engine to take that over,
Yeah.
right? So that solves that compliance GPT.
Definitely.
And then
That's
it
the
just
low level
fills out all
stuff.
forms, does all of that stuff.
But I'll argue that'll never happen, because it's not deterministic in that way. I don't think it can give you if you put in a question, I don't know that it can give you specifically a yes or no answer. And I think that AI itself is ambiguous, right? Which we've experimented with before as well. It's like you put it in there and it's giving you an answer, and it's like, I know that's not the right answer. So how do you know whether that compliance through the AI is actually right? I actually don't think that's AI. I actually think that's more, machine learning, not non-deterministic.
Yep. It's traditional AI, yeah. It's
traditional AI.
Basically, not new AI.
Yeah.
And I agree. And I still think, though, it is possible to build a machine that can do that, can suck in all those risk guidelines. If you ever get a chance to read the Australian Standards on Risk, consequence, likelihood, consequence, controls, really interesting and powerful stuff.
I can't wait, Michael. That's my takeaway. I'm going home to read that.
Read the risk
Australian
analysis.
Standard on Risk. So how do we get
Can
to
you send
that?
me a link?
Oh, how trivial.
No, but it's about
But we
taking
can pump that into AI, is what you're saying.
We'll solve it. Right.
No, but it's about the risk. It's about the risk about giving students, the ability to take risks in a safe zone. And yeah, you're right.
But who
the broken
defines safe?
That's right. It is a broken arm. What is a broken arm?
Yeah.
I mean, in my day, it was a badge of honour. If you left primary school and you hadn't had a broken arm, you weren't trying.
Yeah.
Hard enough. That's right. And I think parents come into that, right? Because there's safety standards from different parents. I remember being outside some place and people were some venue and everyone was filing out, and my boys were climbing this tree, which is about 8 metres high. And I'm getting up near the top, and this little old lady came up and said, "This is terrible. You've got to bring them down. They could fall." I said, "Well, if they fall, we're here, and we're in the city. We can get an ambulance, and we'll pick up the pieces, and they'll no doubt learn from that."
Yeah, they won't go that high
She did
again.
not like that answer. So people have different standards with that and risk that they'll accept. It's a tolerance, risk tolerance.
Well, we do a bit of work with schools, and one school did take out the monkey bars, bring them back in again. They lasted about 6 months. 2 people broke their arms, and the parents were not happy, right? And the principal basically said, "I don't want to deal with the unhappy parents, so I'm going to take them out again." And as sad as they were about that, that's the way that it happened.
So then that's a value, because I think one of the tenets of effective leadership is courage.
Yes.
It's to say that's more important than that expediency or that discomfort.
Yep.
That's more important.
There's
And
an
that's
overarching-
hard. You've got to be able to justify that and live with yourself if a kid breaks an arm on your watch. That's hard.
Courage as a value.
Courage is a value. I think as a leadership attribute,
It's defining. It is.
sadly lacking.
It is defining but lacking.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's affecting the children as well, is
Totally.
how they see that or how they perceive what's happened here. Like obviously these children have seen these 2 people break their arm. They're seeing that the monkey bars are going out. What's the value that they're learning through all of that? Whether it's a lack of courage from the authorities, and what they're taking away from that, because kids are so perceptive to messages.
Yeah.
I say that you can say whatever you want to them. They'll
What
only
you
pick
do.
up the message, right?
So I think one of the messages they get from that is adults are really boring. Rules are dumb.
Yeah.
There's so much in what you just said.
The world shrinks, doesn't it, for them?
Yeah.
It depends on the personality, though, surely.
Yeah. And I think we're teaching people to be safe and be compliant. And it's the paradox in the complexity piece.
Yeah.
That one of the answers, one of the perceived solutions to that is to narrow the world and make things smaller and safer.
Yeah.
Do you think the idea of the world being more complex diminishes our ability to look into the future, because we're dealing with all of this information right here and right now, and we're trying to navigate through that. Do you think that we've lost our ability to think about what the future looks like, or do you think that hasn't changed?
I don't know that we've ever been very good at predicting or looking into the future. I suspect it is distracting, but we also know that it's coming incrementally faster. So there's a mandate there to kind of do it a bit. So again, I think we're trying to split our focus. And are we doing anything well? Yeah.
Well, maybe that goes back to the value, like what there as children are perceiving is happening in the world is like, well, nobody's looking at the future, nobody's thinking about the future, therefore it's a value-based proposition that, well, I'm not going to think about the future either.
Or it's too hard, or it doesn't matter because the rules will stop me doing anything interesting anyway.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that when I went to a kind of a science fair at our local school and asked the students, all of it's about sustainability, right? So everyone's got something to do with sustainability, whether it's recycling or whatever. And I asked them, well, what do you think? So I asked 3 of them, what do you think the solution to the sustainability issue is? And they said, oh, well, somebody's got to do this. And I was like, but that somebody is you.
Yeah.
I think that they've separated themselves from them being the agents of the change. And it seemed to me like they were powerless at that moment. Like these are year 7s, right? They're powerless at that moment to make a change. But I think the idea to give them agency, maybe that's an opportunity
huge
as well.
Yep.
And that's where the choice piece comes in. The challenge is doing something significant that's going to motivate them to do it. Yeah, it's all there.
But arguably, by reducing the size of their world and scope with all of these risk measures, you've taken that agency away, and some third party has been seen, perhaps opaquely in the background, to have taken control of that. So I'm no longer in charge of that. Someone else will handle that. I'll just sit back and comply in this narrow world.
Yeah, because I'm being controlled in that way.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm really looking into Jonathan Haidt's work on the anxious generation. Have you read across that?
No.
And his premise is, as play-based childhood diminishes and online childhood, digital childhood has taken over, we're seeing huge impacts in mental health. But a lot of the driving pressure was societal pressure on parents to be conscientious parents and to be vigilant. And as parents have become more vigilant in the physical world, they've become less vigilant in the online world. And he would argue the risks, the pedophiles are online, they're not in the park anymore. But he just talks about the freedom that kids had and different generations. And it's profound.
So he's saying we should go back to a play-based, in the playground-based system, or as a parents we should understand
Both,
those differences?
everything, yeah.
Yeah.
He says we should encourage more risk in the physical world and less risk in the online world. And he was one of the big advocates for limiting the social media age to 16 and that whole push.
What do you think?
It's really interesting. He has been a paradigm shift for me. I would consider myself a bit of an early adopter. I would consider that the students are growing up in this world. They have to know how to navigate it. But his argument for me is really compelling. Yeah.
When I was a kid, I bought a little computer that you plugged in and whatever. We talked a little bit about that, about this membrane. And my dad was like, what are you doing with that? Put that away, and limited me to 1 hour a day to be any screen time. So I just did this computer thing because it was magical. It was like, wow, this can do this. And my parents didn't see any value in that. And I'm torn by this media or this social media about the fact that, if I have the same attitude as my parents saying I can't play with computers, which became the future, right?
Yeah.
Am I taking that away from them because social media will become the future?
And we're all scared of the things, society is scared of the things they don't understand or that's new. Yes, which is why I've always said it's a tech world. Like, kids need to be tech savvy. I think they do. But I think if you look at the neuroscience and the brain development, the social media and the subversive nature that you spoke about is too powerful for the developing brain.
It's interesting you say that about your family interest and background, because my father was programming P2P11s in the late 60s, and so he bought me my first computer in 84, the Apple II, whatever, and I'd spend 8-10 hours a day sometimes straight on it, you know, just like crazy amount of time. And we're really lucky that the school in that same year in 84 started a class specifically on IT, and we had a systems analyst run the class, so he taught us everything. But what was interesting in my upbringing, we had both. We had the outdoor thing. We had, you know, the engine's out of the car. You've got to change the clutch. We're doing that this weekend. You know, there's more problems. We've got to pull the whole thing apart. And, you know, being an engineer father, it was very detailed into everything had to be done from scratch and designed from first principles. Back of the envelope, here's the formula, and we'll work through how it works.
Yeah.
So maybe it's the fact that it's the balance of both sides have got to be there. You can't.
Well, that's
just be
what
one.
John is suggesting. To have that good balance.
And I think that's the answer to complexity. To not be binary, to not be one way or the other, but to have balance, the and with, and be intentional about the emphasis.
That's a good spot to wrap up, I think, on this edition. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you, Justine.
Pleasure. It was fantastic. Yeah.
Let's go into your background too. Let's do a to-camera piece about introducing you.
Yep.
Shall we start that off and say...
So what's your background? Where did you...
So
How did you land where you landed?
Self-confessed teacher tragic. I grew up always wanting to be a teacher, was never going to be anything else. So, like the computer pool, friends, family will tell ridiculous stories of being put in classrooms with teddy bears from a very early age. Then I just have felt like I've been able to play in my passion my whole career. Always in independent schools and a lot of time in gifted ed. So really looking at those high potential learners and what they're capable of. And then going into leadership and coming to see that all children have that innate capability, and how do we best harness that. So, and then I'm a leader now, and what I love about that is just informing the learning culture, like the organisational culture of a school and the possibilities for what education can be. I want it to feel inspiring. I want kids to feel alive and motivated and take their conversations home to the dinner table. So that's how I spend my days and hours.
What do you think about the innate ability of students and how that is respected or not respected in the classroom or in society, maybe generally?
I think historically we've got a really narrow way of judging that. And so we very quickly, back to the binary thinking, we very quickly decide that a kid is bright or not, or capable or not, or a writer or not, or artistic or not, or musical or not, rather than, as you talk about, a continuum to just evolve and be developed. So I'm all right around the 10,000 hours and that can do, but I think passion and motivation, and there is an aptitude piece where people are going to be drawn to certain things, and then that kind of is the natural consequence of practice and time on a particular passion.
I do think that we underestimate
we do.
What they're capable of doing.
We do.
And it might be your own protection mechanism as a teacher for that. I'm not sure what that means, but to allow the kids to be what they are capable of being. The story I have is that I do teaching in classrooms, and from stage 1 right through to stage 6 or whatever it is, and I would say that the responses to the way that I teach in stage 1 is much more dynamic, much more intuitive. And it might be that it may not be necessarily that the stage 1 knows the answers rather than stage 6 knowing the answers, but it's about and maybe the people in high school don't want to, they're much a peer group and they don't want to look like they're smarty pants, or they don't want to challenge anyone, so they don't say anything, and it's really hard to tap into their knowledge. But in stage 1 they'll just happily tell you anything that they believe. So there's a bit of that, and you have to, but you can kind of see it. But I do believe that there is, in that stage 1, it's beautifully dynamic about what they can imagine and what they can think. And I think if you can tap into that, well, not only tap into that, but keep that alive.
That's our job, to foster it and nurture it. You know, like I often say, we see kindergarten at the beginning of the year trying to walk from one point to another, and the line snakes and they jump and skip and look at something and stop, and by the the end of the year they're walking in a lovely straight line, and I'm like, how do we let that happen?
Yeah, that's not success.
No, no. Why do we? And I don't know that we even explicitly try to do that. But so there's some, normative stuff that goes on as well. But I think if we can be countercultural in a classroom, like, they say the teacher sets the environment, they set the climate. And so if we can keep a climate of curiosity and openness to ambiguity and play in big ideas, then we're partway there.
And courage. Be courageous in that.
Well, it's empowerment.
Yeah, it is.
It's getting them to recognise their capacity.
Yep.
And when you talk about splitting hairs, I would use capacity as opposed to ability. Like capacity is temporal, whereas ability is perceived as fixed, right? So I would say, what's their capacity at the moment for something, and how do we foster that and develop that?
Nice.
In other things.
We should use that in a professional sense.
We should.
Capacity and ability. Well, where does skill fit? Somewhere between the two.
Skill contributes to capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a
but that's the subtlety of that is the subtlety of the English language, probably in particular.
Yeah.
I asked you as we were walking down into this about the idea of what's the difference between, Michael, you might find this interesting as well, what's the difference between fairness and justice?
Yeah.
Right? Because as far as I understand, that is unique to English, that differentiation. And I believe that in a classroom, you're probably likely to have children say that's fair and unfair rather than that's unjust, right? So there's, I believe, as I think you said as well, there's a complexity to justice that doesn't exist in fairness. And it's just a progression of something. So there's something deeper in the word justice that doesn't exist in fairness. And you'd find a barrister would say justice every time. So there's something, maybe it's just snobbiness that I'm saying justice rather than fairness.
I will say to kids, fair isn't everybody gets the same. Fair is everybody gets what they need. And so they can, like, it just undermines that. Oh, they got,
Yes.
And I say, well, if you came to me with a broken arm and I said, I can't give you plaster because I haven't got enough for the whole class, would that be fair? And of course they say, no, you'd be ridiculous. But
Yeah.
So maybe there's something in that one of the shifts in society is that fair is increasingly defined as everyone gets the same, not just what they need. Discuss.
Well, who determines the level of need?
Yeah.
If you look at the minimum wage, not very well. It's diversity and universality.
Yeah.